It was June 6, 1944 in France. The day began just like any other day. Jean-Paul Fortier, aged 3 at the time, was playing outside with a tennis ball. He looked up from playing for a minute only to see trucks and tanks full of German soldiers. They waved at him and he waved back. He was blissfully ignorant of the terrible events that were about to take place just miles from his home. In a few hours, the beaches of Normandy would be covered with the bodies of dead soldiers and filled with the sounds of gunshots and mine explosions. These attacks made up the event we now know as D-Day. D-Day was crucial to help end World War II. Adolf Hitler headed Germany's ruthless empire for more than 10 years, conquering a fair amount of Europe during his reign. Germany was quickly gaining more and more power. Hitler's main threat and enemy, Great Britain, was badly in need of help and supplies from the United States. Yet Americans remained neutral. Hitler's biggest mistake was attacking Soviet Russia and not properly preparing for a war. Once they attacked Russia, Germany's strength began to falter. However, they remained in France. The United States saw Germany's new weakness as a chance to enter the war and help their ally, Great Britain. Together, the United States and Britain began planning D-Day. The planning for the event began in late 1943, and the idea was first presented in August 1943 at the Quebec Conference. In its early stages, the invasion plan was a British operation called Roundup, which would move troops into Europe in the event of German collapse, which seemed to be quickly approaching. When the United States joined the war, the idea was transformed into a combined Allied operation to cross the English Channel and break Germany further. Dwight Eisenhower was the head of the invasion because most of the troops would be American. English generals led the air, naval, and ground forces.
The Allies had millions of soldiers and planned to attack from the air, water, and ground, the deadly trifecta. The plan was christened Overlord by Winston Churchill. 5 divisions of tens of thousands of men were to land along a 50-mile wide front in Normandy, France. They chose Normandy because Brittany coasts were far too west of England. It was dangerous to go too far east because the Belgian tides were too strong to pass through. Also, the Germans were already waiting on Pas-de-Calais. The front consisted of 5 individual regions of Normandy's coast: Juno, Omaha, Gold, Sword, and Utah beaches. England went to the beaches of Normandy because the English beaches were similar in composition. This made it simple to train for D-Day in England. They were able to test the resistance of their equipment in the sand. It was a surprise attack that would determine the fate of the war. The Germans had also been preparing. They knew that the Allies were going to invade France in order to move the groundwork to German soil. However, when and where the Allies would storm ashore was unknown. Additionally, the British created a center, the Control Section, in London, which sent false information to confuse foreign services such as Germany. Many of the pieces of information set up from the Control Section were constructed to lead German generals into believing that the Allies' objective consisted of attacking mostly Pas-de-Calais regions. As a result, most German strategists believed that this was the destination of the Anglo-American attack, and with good reason, for it was where the English Channel is narrowest. Therefore, the strongest German defenses were constructed there.
Still, the Allied forces were aware that feeding false information was not enough to deceive these war criminals. As a ploy of deception, the British placed tanks and inflatable lures such as balloons that looked like tanks, cannons, and warships. This setup appeared quite convincing from an aerial view that base camps were being set up in the area directly across from Pas-de-Calais. To enhance the fake planned attack, the Allied forces dropped bombs on Pas-de-Calais region the night before D-Day eventually occurred. When Allied ships and men began to invade the Norman coast, Germans believed it was a diversion for the real attack coming in the west coast. The false information and tactics that the Allied forces publicized were a part of Operation Fortitude, which proved to be a huge success in contributing to the end result of D-Day. Without Operation Fortitude, German troops would not have been as overwhelmed. The first step of the attack was an airborne attack. Departing from air bases around southern Britain, the Allied Air Force, composed of the American 101st Airborne and 82nd Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Divisions, began arriving over Normandy. The British divisions had 3 tasks: to destroy bridges over the river Dives so the Germans couldn't use them to rush reinforcements to the beaches, to capture the bridges across the River Orne and Caen Canal, and to capture German defenses at Merville. The British 6th Airborne Division secured the Orne River crossings and accomplished its objectives. However, the 13,000 men of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airbornes were less fortunate as their drops were scattered, which spread the units out and placed many far from their targets. The attack on the beaches began at approximately 5:10 a.m. on June 6, 1944. Allied soldiers were bombing Germans all along the Norman coast. This was followed by heavy naval bombardment of the beaches, and then, in the early morning hours, waves of Allied troops began reaching the beaches. To the east, the British and Canadians came ashore on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. After overcoming initial resistance, they were able to move inland. However, only the Canadians were able to reach the D-Day objectives. On the American beaches to the west, the situation was very different.
The plans for attack on Utah Beach fell apart even before the first troops hit the sand. Utah Beach was suitable for attack, but behind it was a marshy plain which the Germans had flooded. 3 of the control crafts were lost on the approach, and the tanks were useless. 10 miles to the east, on Omaha Beach, the landings came very close to disaster. Omaha Beach was not an ideal landing point because it ended in a steep shingle bank, which blocked any Allied tanks. Even though there were disadvantages, Omaha was still the best landing ground between Utah Beach and was essential if the Allies would have any chance of forming a single beachhead along the Norman coast. About half of the tanks allocated to the attack were lost on the way in, as was most of the artillery. Gold Beach was the first of the British beaches. The beach sloped gently up to a seawall, which made them more vulnerable to the naval bombardment. Along most of the beach, the German coastal defenses were quickly overwhelmed. The British tanks landed successfully and played a key part in this victory. At first, the Canadian landings on Juno Beach appeared like they were going to develop into another disaster like Omaha Beach. The rough seas delayed the Canadians and allowed the Germans to recover themselves after the air and naval bombardment. Also, the tide had lowered, making the beaches more dangerous, and many landing crafts were lost. The troops landing on Sword Beach easily breached the coastal defenses, but the Germans had an unexpected second line of defenses. Not enough troops were able to bypass the second line, and the Canadians' objective, capturing the city of Caen, was not complete. The Allied forces took advantage of the period in which the German soldiers displayed immense weakness because they were not prepared for this ambitious attack on the Norman coast of France by the Anglo-Americans. The preparation for the attack was extensive, demanding, and quite tedious. The Allied generals were aware that D-Day would not ultimately end World War II, but hoped it would have a big impact upon the terminating of the war relatively soon. Following D-Day, the nation of Germany would undergo multiple problematic battles for months at end. Finally, the Germans unconditionally surrendered on May 7, 1945, to the United States in Reims, France.